Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Apple. I'm a PhD candidate in musicology at the University of Memphis, and I would like to thank you for taking the time to view my 2021 Historic Brass Society Symposium presentation. The keyed trumpet, Trompete in German, was the world's first fully chromatic trumpet. It was invented sometime in the 1790s by adding keys, like those found on woodwind instruments, to the natural trumpet. The best-known works composed for the instrument are the Haydn Trumpet Concerto, the first major solo work for fully chromatic trumpet, and the Hummel Trumpet Concerto, both written for the Viennese court trumpeter Anton Weidinger in 1796 and 1804, respectively. Since their rediscovery in the 20th century, these concertos have become two of the most beloved pieces in the trumpet's modern concert repertory, though they are most commonly performed on modern valve trumpets today. Several misconceptions about the keyed trumpet and its music persist. These include the idea that the keyed trumpet was only used as a solo instrument, that it did not find widespread acceptance, that it had little music composed for it, and that it was quickly replaced by the early valve trumpet. However, thanks to research by scholars such as Jaroslav Rocek and Sabina Klaus, we now know that the keyed trumpet continued to be manufactured and played into the 1840s, decades after the invention of the valve trumpet, and that it was used in a variety of musical contexts, including military bands, chamber ensembles, church orchestras, and the Italian opera pit. My own catalog has grown to include around 490 sources of keyed trumpet music, which firmly puts to rest the notion that the instrument had little music composed for it, and strongly suggests that it was much more widely employed than previously thought. One area of music making not widely discussed is purely instrumental music for orchestra. While I have yet to find a symphony that makes use of the keyed trumpet, I have cataloged 53 works for dance orchestra. 43 of these pieces were composed by Josef Lahner and Johann Strauss Sr. between 1826 and 1832. These works can be found in the Wien Bibliothek im Rathaus music collection, where the majority of Lahner and Strauss's surviving musical manuscripts are held. Though overshadowed by their successor Strauss Jr., Lahner and Strauss Sr. are chiefly remembered as the fathers of the Viennese Waltz. By this, I do not mean that they invented the waltz. The waltz and other related dances such as Ländler and Deutscher had in fact been widely popular folk dances in Vienna for some time before Lahner and Strauss were even born. And the waltz well and truly became one of the city's main manias during the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Lahner and Strauss Sr. did, however, take the relatively simple folk waltz and alter and expand it to resemble the classical waltz we are familiar with today. Before the contributions of Lahner and Strauss Sr., waltzes and other related German couples dances were simply a series of short binary form dances in triple meter. Inspired by the waltzes of Carl Maria von Weber, Lahner and Strauss began to add an introduction to their waltzes and a coda that recapitulated material introduced earlier in the work. In addition, both composers elevated the quality and complexity of the melodies, harmonies, and instrumentation of these types of works. One of their grand achievements in orchestration was their use of the keyed trumpet, which allowed them to be among the first composers to write prominent melody lines for fully chromatic trumpet and orchestral dances. In short, Strauss Sr. and Lahner laid the pioneering groundwork that would be further developed and brought to perfection by Strauss Jr. and his siblings in the later half of the 19th century. The careers of Lahner and Strauss Sr. were tightly bound from the outset. In 1819, Strauss joined Lahner's trio as a violist. In 1823 and 1824, both men played violin in the dance orchestra of Mikhail Palmer, who was the music director of the Schwirl, a restaurant that boasted one of Vienna's most celebrated dance halls. In May of 1824, Lahner left Palmer's orchestra and struck out on his own, expanding his chamber group into a small string orchestra, and Strauss went with him. This small string group would develop quickly into a core ensemble of first, second, and third violin, double bass, one flute, two clarinets, two horns, one trumpet, and timpani. The popularity and success of Lahner's orchestra grew rapidly, and on September 1st, 1825, Lahner further expanded his musical forces to include a second orchestra, of which he named Strauss the director. Their partnership lasted another 2 years, until Strauss formed his own dance ensemble in May of 1827. No thanks to a few non-contemporary accounts of their separation, Various myths have arisen that claim that Lahner and Strauss parted on bad terms and became bitter enemies. While it is true that the two men's fans often pitted themselves against one another, arguing over who was the better composer and performer, and that their publishers encouraged this discourse for commercial gain, in reality, Lahner and Strauss became at worst amicable rivals. Of the two composers, it was Lahner who first employed the keyed trumpet in his orchestral dances, in his Aufforderung zum Tanze, Opus 7. This piece was first performed prior to Strauss and Lahner's split at a ball held for the benefit of the then retired and ailing Palmer at the Inn zum Schwarzen Bock in Vienna on October 19, 1826. The work takes its title from Weber's well-known 1819 piano work. However, Lahner did far more than simply borrow this earlier work's title. He also, as can be seen from his waltz's first violin part, took the rondo theme from measures 36 to 59 and the waltz melody from measures 98 to 129 from Weber's work and used them as the main tunes of the first number and trio of his waltz. Lahner's Opus 7 is also the first time that he ended one of his waltzes with a coda that recapitulates material introduced earlier in the work, which is a formal element that Lahner likewise borrowed directly from Weber. It is here in the coda of Lahner's Aufforderung zum Tanze where the keyed trumpet makes its first and only appearance in the waltz. Lahner begins this coda with a solo performed by two Kloppentrompete in D. As this is the first time that Lahner employed the keyed trumpet, it is likely that the inclusion of the two keyed trumpets was intended as a novel surprise. This conclusion is further supported by the fact that Lahner attempts to play coy by having the keyed trumpet solo begin with a fanfare that could have been played on natural trumpets, before having both keyed trumpets burst into a melody that required the use of their keys. Those familiar with the Haydn trumpet concerto will know that he plays a similarly cheeky joke at the beginning of that work. Lahner's use of the keyed trumpet in this coda set several important precedents that foreshadow how he and Strauss would employ the instrument in their future waltzes. Firstly, in their waltzes that used the keyed trumpet, Lahner and Strauss typically employed one or two trumpeters who switched between playing natural trumpet and keyed trumpet. In this coda, Lahner asks his one trumpeter to switch to the keyed trumpet and instructs his second horn player to do the same. Secondly, Lahner and Strauss usually use the keyed trumpet in only one or two of a waltz's numbers, and sometimes its coda to play brief melodic solos and accompanying figures that employ non-harmonic series notes. Their restrained use of the keyed trumpet in their waltzes helped to make those sections that did include it stand out, while not overusing the instrument to the point that its novelty lost its impact. It also appears that Lahner already possessed a deep understanding of the keyed trumpet's idiosyncrasies. This is evidenced by the kind of melody lines that he wrote for the two keyed trumpets in his coda, such as in measures 17 to 32. While the keyed trumpet is a fully chromatic instrument that can technically play in every key, it does not sound equally good in all tonalities. This is because the notes that are achieved using the instrument's keys have a noticeably different tone quality than the naturally occurring notes of the harmonic series and tend to be more difficult to play in tune. While this problem was minimized when the keyed trumpet was in the hands of a virtuoso like Anton Weidinger, most composers avoided these intonation issues by restricting melodies for the instrument to those keys that required the fewest keyed notes to execute, written keys with up to one or two sharps or flats. In this coda, we can see that Lahner has done just that, crooking the keyed trumpet so that they are playing in the written key of C, the instrument's most stable key, and mainly using notes outside of the key as passing tones. Both Lahner and Strauss appear to have understood this principle and consistently kept it in mind when writing melodic material for the keyed trumpet. This does not mean, however, that Lahner and Strauss never made use of the instrument's chromatic capabilities, just that they did so sparingly. For example, Lahner employs brief moments of chromaticism in measures 19, 23, and 105 of this coda to give a hint of what the instrument is capable of, but not to such a degree that the instrument's shortcomings become readily apparent. took until 1828 for Strauss to compose a piece that called for the keyed trumpet. His first work to do so was his Walzer alla Paganini. As can be seen from this work's first violin part, the piece quotes the beginning of the Rondo da Campanella from Paganini's Concerto No. 2 as part of its introduction in order to capitalize on the popularity of Paganini, who was giving concerts in Vienna at the time. If this piece's trumpet part is anything to go by, however, it appears that Strauss was not quite trusting enough of the key trumpet at this point to give it its own exposed melody lines. So instead, he simply has it play an accompanying role in the waltz's fourth number and coda. Lahner and Strauss Sr. went on to write a total of 10 and 12 waltzes with key trumpet respectively, but these are not the only dances in which they employed the instrument. Both composers also used the key trumpet in gallops and marches, with the former composing 4 gallops with key trumpet and the latter 5, and both composing 1 march each that employ the instrument. Strauss and Lahner's marches are usually rather stately affairs and were typically performed at the beginning of a ball to accompany the opening promenade. Their gallops, on the other hand, are extremely energetic and being played at a fast clip and were typically danced immediately after the conclusion of a waltz as a form of cathartic release for all the couples who had spent the entirety of the preceding waltz winding themselves into a frenzy. Representative examples of both kinds of pieces with keyed trumpet can be found in Strauss's Der Raub der Sabinerinnen, which was premiered during a society ball on February 8, 1831 in the Sperl. This piece is unique in its creative output for being his only known attempt at composing a multi-movement program piece, with each movement portraying a different part of the story of the abduction of the Sabine women. According to the myth, the Romans apparently did not have enough women to populate Rome at its founding, so they held a fair to which they invited their neighbors, the Sabine. The first movement of the work, entitled Einzugmarsch, or Entrance March in English, is intended to portray the arrival of the Romans to the fair. This is followed by the Entführungsgalopp, or kidnapping gallop, which subverts the typical order of ball dances by coming after a march rather than a waltz, and is meant to represent the confusion that broke out when the Romans suddenly began abducting the Sabine women. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Sabine took umbrage, which led to war. But when the two sides eventually met on the battlefield, it was the Sabine women, now wives and mothers in Rome, who pleaded for both sides to make peace and become one people. The resolution of this conflict is represented by the work's final movement, entitled Versöhnungswaltz, or Reconciliation Waltz. Strauss employs the keyed trumpet in all 3 movements of the work, and the 2 keyed trumpets essentially fulfill the same roles in the march and gallop as they do in Lahner and Strauss's waltzes, except in a far more concentrated fashion. In the opening march, both keyed trumpets perform a combination of accompanying figures and short melodic solos, including what are obviously meant to be military fanfares in measures 27 to 30, intended to emphasize the Romans' martial character. In the gallop, the keyed trumpets play a secondary role, but are still important for helping to establish the gallop's dramatic shift to a minor key and darker tone. During times of the year when dancing was either less popular or forbidden in Vienna, as was the case during Lent, both Lahner and Strauss gave regular orchestra concerts at indoor venues such as the Leopoldstadt Theater and outdoor locations such as the Paradiesgarten, pictured here. Lahner and Strauss's concerts were very well attended, with those held outside often having audiences that numbered in the thousands, and their concert programs offered a variety of both serious and light music. They typically began with an overture by a popular composer of the day, such as Donizetti, Rossini, or Beethoven, This would then be followed by a mix of Lahner and Strauss's own dance pieces and potpourris, and works by other composers, such as movements of symphonies, and during Lahner's concerts, the occasional violin concerto, for which Lahner would serve as soloist. Lahner and Strauss's potpourris were some of their few works meant solely for concert performance. These long orchestral pieces were created by stitching together arrangements of excerpts from popular works by other composers and sections of their own dances to form a kind of crowd-pleasing best hits variety piece. This type of work may not seem the most creatively rich by today's standards, but back in a time before radios and widely available recordings, they often served as the only way for many audience members to hear the music of the latest popular opera or ballet performed in an orchestral setting. Though Lahner only composed 2 potpourris with key trumpet and Strauss just 1, they are important to our discussion for being some of the few pieces in which both composers wrote for the key trumpet in a fashion that approached the virtuosity found in the surviving solo works for the instrument. An example of this can be seen in Strauss's Musikalisches Ragout potpourri, first performed on March 6, 1831, during a reunion concert in the Spreu. The work consists of 27 numbers and ends with a number sung by a male chorus with orchestral accompaniment. The key trumpet is only used in the work's 7th, 9th, and 20th numbers, with the trumpet parts to numbers 9 and 20 being similar to what we have come to expect from Strauss's dance pieces. However, the key trumpet part to the 7th number is more technically demanding than most of his other key trumpet parts. Here, the key trumpet begins the number by playing in harmony with the clarinet. In its B section, the clarinet drops out and the key trumpet continues alone. Though Strauss still restricted the key trumpet to playing in the key of written C, in both sections, the melodic material that the instrument performs is far more technically challenging than most found in Strauss and Lahner's orchestral dance works. Requiring the trumpeter to execute fluid scales and ornaments, it makes more use of the instrument's upper register. After 1831, Strauss stopped composing for the key trumpet and began to employ the early valve trumpet instead, and Lahner did the same a year later. The decision to do so makes a great deal of sense, since the early valve trumpet has advantages over the key trumpet in terms of intonation, timbral consistency, and a greatly expanded lower register. It should be pointed out, however, that they both started employing the early valve trumpet somewhat later than a number of their contemporaries, including Joseph Keil, the first professor of the early valve trumpet, who introduced the instrument into the Prague Conservatory's curriculum in 1826. Though Lahner and Strauss Sr. did eventually replace the keyed trumpet with the valve trumpet and made use of the keyed trumpet for a relatively small part of their careers, the instrument was, for a time, an integral member of their dance orchestras and, by extension, the soundscape of Viennese citizens' everyday lives during those first critical years when they were working to build their reputations as composers and orchestra leaders. Thank you all for taking the time to view my presentation. I look forward to seeing all of you who are able to attend my Q&A very soon.